So, the Four Horsemen, the group of men that many consider as the greatest faction in the history of professional wrestling. Although the Horsemen began life as a heel faction, over time, the word Horseman became synonymous with the word tradition. Many factions who followed in their footsteps have much to thank the Horsemen for. No team in professional wrestling should call themselves the elite before having a word with Ric Flair and Arn Anderson. Of course, as time went on, some members of the Horsemen would leave, others would come in, and the group would break up only to reunite again. It can get convoluted, it can get questionable, and some members of the Four Horsemen will leave you scratching your head. But let's get into it as we take a look at WCW's premier faction, the true elite of pro wrestling, the Four Horsemen. In the mid-80s, Arn Anderson was working in the Pensacola area when Ric Flair made a stop in the territory. Ric was involved with the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, Ole Anderson and Gene Anderson at the time, frequently teaming up with the Wrecking Crew during the same time when he met Arn Anderson in Pensacola. After watching Arn work in the ring, Ric Flair felt he had potential, and so he put in a good word for Arn with Jim Crockett, and so Arn Anderson got hired. Just a heads up, in case you didn't know, the Anderson family as a whole was a kayfabe family. Arn and Ole were not real brothers, but the resemblance was pretty unbelievable. It made sense to put Arn and Ole together, and this is exactly what happened. Arn Anderson replaced Gene Anderson when he became Ole's full-time tag partner. Big shoes to fill for sure, but Arn was more than capable of holding his own. Modern fans who watch my channel are maybe familiar with the Revival in today's WWE. Well, the Andersons were the original Revival. This isn't a knock on Scott Dawson and Dash Wilder either. I think those guys are incredibly fun to watch. But anyway, Arn Anderson learned a lot from Ole Anderson in the ring, and behind the scenes, Arn was learning a lot from the Nature Boy Ric Flair also. Gene Anderson and Ole Anderson back in the 70s were incredibly over as heels in the Southeast. When Ric Flair was trying to make a name for himself in the Southeast, he was billed as a cousin of the Andersons. This not only gave him prestige by association on TV screens, but it also meant he would have a real life bond with the Andersons both inside and outside the ring. Flair and the Minnesota Wrecking Crew had always teamed up together, and now with Arn being part of the Andersons, it was natural for Ric to begin teaming with him also. This is pretty much your genesis of the Four Horsemen here, as you can see the reasons for Ric and the Andersons functioning as a unit in pro wrestling. Tully Blanchard came in from Southeast Championship Wrestling, and his demeanour and attitude also made him a natural partner for the Andersons and Flair. Tully became the television champion, and because he was a heel and NWA champion Ric Flair was also a heel, the two frequently teamed up in 8-man tags along with the Andersons to close out shows. Tully Blanchard was incredibly fun to watch. He was one of the first cool bad guy characters in wrestling. His promos were great, and in the ring he was insanely good. I still feel that Tully Blanchard is underrated, even still to this very day. But anyway, to begin with, the Andersons, Flair and Tully mainly feuded with Magnum TA, Dusty Rhodes and the Road Warriors. Of note here is that Magnum TA became a standout superstar during this time period. Dusty Rhodes and Ric Flair were feuding over Ric's NWA title during this time also. One of the most important nights in the history of the Horsemen happened at the Omni in Atlanta when Ric Flair, kayfabe, broke Dusty Rhodes' leg while the Andersons and Tully held Dusty down inside a steel cage. There was genuine heat that night. Dusty said that fans were cheering for Ric earlier in the night, but after the leg incident, the heat got turned up a notch and the fans were extremely angry at what just happened. It gave the Rhodes vs Flair feud a real boost. Fans wanted to see the American Dream take out Flair, and they were willing to pay their hard-earned money to see the encounter. Around this time, J.J Dillon got introduced as Tully Blanchard's manager. Tully was once managed by Baby Doll, but when that relationship turned sour, J.J was brought in as the new corner man for Tully. Eventually, J.J Dillon would also manage Flair and the Andersons, although it should be mentioned that J.J had also managed Tully before he even became associated with the Andersons and Ric Flair in the Carolinas. Dillon was great too. He had just found this literal goldmine of a faction to work with, everyone holding belts, all great talkers, every member looking the part. J.J. Dillon was a great fit. So how did the Four Horsemen get their name? Well, we have Arn Anderson to thank for it. The group was named during a promo featuring the faction that was really only produced due to time constraints. Arn Anderson said, "It was almost a fluke. In those days, in the Crockett studios, we would do local interviews for local markets. One day, we had about 3 minutes to cover 3 matches. There wasn't enough interview time for us to have one each, so there was an idea to consolidate them. I looked at the 4 guys around me, and it popped in my head out of nowhere, the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse." All the negative connotations that surround the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, I felt kinda suited our situation. After the interview, Tony Schiavone said that we had just stumbled onto something. So the Horseman name didn't come from a creative meeting, it didn't come from a genius writer, it didn't come from the owner of the company. The Four Horsemen name came due to a wrestler thinking for himself on the spot and coming up with absolute magic. When they officially got their name, the Four Horsemen just continued to get more over. The Four Horsemen became a symbol of excellence, the group was the cream of the crop, and as Ric Flair said, diamonds are forever, and so was the Four Horsemen. The Horsemen would begin styling and profiling together, dressed in expensive suits and dripping with championship gold. They looked the part, and Triple H said it best when he said that the Four Horsemen seemed like the athletic version of corporate greed. The Horsemen consisted of sharp-dressed, successful super heels that practically no one could touch, and they became so bad that they were cool. The Horsemen would brag about their cars, their clothes, their homes, their success, their wealth, all while dressed in their business suits, looking like absolute superstars. It wasn't all just for show though, they were badasses in the ring, no one could touch them. The natural enemy of the Horsemen then would be the common man, Dusty Rhodes, the absolute opposite of what the Four Horsemen represented. The Horseman vs Dusty feud pretty much carried Jim Crockett Promotions throughout the mid-80s, with Dusty's matches against Ric Flair over the NWA Championship drawing big money and selling out arenas. In February of 1987, new kid on the block Lex Luger wanted to become a Horseman, and he was indeed made an associate member of the Elite faction. Ole was getting phased out of the group, he wasn't showing up for dates and he had become unreliable. When Arn and Ole lost the tag titles at Starrcade 86, Ole was kicked out and Lex Luger officially became a Horseman. This was a turning point. The original faction had been broken up, but of course the name continued. Lex Luger was seriously green at this time. He was still learning the ropes, but the Horsemen tried their best here to take Luger under their wing and try to mould him into a superstar. It was an odd decision for sure. The Horsemen were known for having a certain pedigree when it came to in-ring ability, and Lex didn't have it at this time. Luger's timing also couldn't have been any worse, as the Horsemen embarked on a War Games tour with Dusty Rhodes, the Road Warriors, and Nikita Koloff. In a matter of months, Lex Luger found himself in 4 brutal War Games matches, and you'd think this would be enough to cement him as a full-time Horseman, but it wasn't meant to be. Luger was kicked out of the Horsemen due to his bickering with J.J. Dillon, and he found himself teaming with Barry Windham to feud with the faction, leading to Luger and Windham capturing the NWA tag titles at the first Clash of the Champions show. Soon enough though, Windham turned on Lex and joined the Horsemen. Windham was an excellent addition to the faction. The guy was a naturally gifted worker and he was super over. In September of 1988, Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard left the Horsemen to become the Brainbusters in the WWF. Both Arn and Tully realised they were being grossly underpaid during their later days in Jim Crockett Promotions, with Tully revealing that J.J. Dillon, the Horsemen's manager, was paid 3 times as much as he was for their performance at the 1988 Great American Bash. Arn Anderson said, "Tully and I always felt we were the nucleus of that group, along with Rick, and without us, there was no Horseman. When we left, we took the Horsemen with us. According to Rick, there was a lot of people glad that we were gone, but there were also those people who knew that we carried that company, and I'm sure it scared them to death." Ted Turner purchased Jim Crockett Promotions in 1988, and the company was now being ran in a totally different way. Flair had said that the weeks following the buyout gave him his very first exposure to politics in wrestling. He had a real hard time adjusting to the new management and bookers who came into WCW, including Jim Herd. Meanwhile, the Brainbusters were over in the WWF having some really good matches with the likes of the Rockers, Strikeforce and Demolition. Flair, Windham and J.J. still referred to themselves as the Horsemen, but soon enough, J.J Dillon also left for the WWF, effectively ending this era of the Horsemen. To be honest, it was already pretty much done with when Arn and Tully left, and even though Barry Windham's brother Kendall came in as a Horseman, and for some reason Hiro Matsuda was brought in as a spokesman, nothing really came of it. Soon enough, Barry Windham also left for the WWF. The Four Horsemen, who helped make the NWA what it was in the mid-80s, was no more. Arn Anderson decided to leave the World Wrestling Federation due to the schedule. He had a 3-year-old son at the time and he wanted to go home. Tully Blanchard also gave his notice to Vince and he was planning on coming back to WCW. Due to failing a wellness test in the WWF, Tully was not brought back into WCW. Arn and Ole, however, did make it back to World Championship Wrestling, with Arn agreeing to work again for the company on a lighter schedule. Naturally, plans were put in place to reform the Four Horsemen. After Sting helped old rival Ric Flair fend off an attack from Terry Funk in the Great Muta, and after Flair and Sting defeated Muta and Funk at Halloween Havoc 1989, Sting was made an official member of the Four Horsemen. So now the team consisted of the Andersons, Ric Flair and Sting. Sting's involvement with the Horsemen was really all about setting up an angle pitting Flair against the Stinger once again, and at Clash of the Champions 10, Sting was kicked out of the group. You can learn more about the whole angle in my Sting video, but it was clear that Sting was never meant to be a full-time Horseman. Besides, Sting didn't really need the faction, and the faction didn't really need Sting. In May of 1990, Barry Windham returned to WCW and realigned himself with the Horsemen, while new member Sid Vicious joined the group shortly thereafter. I never felt Sid was a good fit for the Horsemen. He just didn't carry himself as well as the likes of Arn, Rick and Tully, but at this point, you'll see that people just came into the Horsemen on a whim. Ric Flair said, "To describe Sid Vicious as a member of the Horsemen is embarrassing. He had no talent, a bad attitude, and he never should have been there. He was so far from what we were, it was ridiculous." Due to a contract dispute with Jim Herd, Ric Flair left WCW, joining the WWF and taking his world title with him. While in the World Wrestling Federation, Flair had success, capturing the WWF Championship during his stint with the company. While Flair was gone, Sid also left WCW to join the World Wrestling Federation, and Arn Anderson began teaming with Larry Zbyszko in WCW, naming themselves the Enforcers. Barry Windham went into a solo feud with Lex Luger. As the months went on, Ric Flair felt he wouldn't fit into WWF's youth movement, and in the end, he didn't renew his WWF contract. Flair came back to WCW and, once again, the Horsemen were put back together. Arn Anderson and Ric Flair promised a Horseman reunion at Slamboree 1993, and while the original plan was for Tully Blanchard to come back, a deal could not be reached, and instead, Paul Roma was introduced as a Horseman. Ole Anderson also came back as a Horseman advisor, but he only made one appearance during this incarnation. This version of the Horseman, to me, was the absolute worst. I'm sure Paul Roma has his fans, but it didn't work at all for me. This iteration of the Horsemen lasted only a few months, and the group broke up after the overseas incident involving Arn Anderson, Sid Vicious, and a pair of scissors. 2 years later, at Halloween Havoc 1995, the Horsemen once again got back together. This time, the group consisted initially of Ric Flair, Arn Anderson and Brian Pillman. Soon afterwards, Chris Benoit was added to the group. Adding Benoit and Pillman was a smart move to kickstart this new version of the Horseman. Both guys were incredible workers and they had vastly different personalities that added a lot to the Horseman's overall character. It was important too for the Horseman to contain younger wrestlers, as Arn and Flair were indeed getting on a bit here. Pillman, however, only lasted as a Horseman for a few months, leaving WCW to join ECW and eventually the World Wrestling Federation in early '96. Pillman, I felt, was a great Horseman. His loose cannon gimmick around this time led to Arn Anderson trying to keep him in check, while Brian was, quite simply, a lunatic on the mic and in the ring. It was good stuff. Pillman was replaced in mid-1996 by Steve Mongo McMichael, ranking up there as maybe the absolute worst member of the Four Horsemen and making Paul Roma and Sid Vicious look like absolute legends of the faction. McMichael joined the faction at the '96 Great American Bash after Arn and Flair paid him to take out his partner Kevin Green during a tag match, and along with Steve McMichael came Deborah, who became an associate of the Horsemen. So now we had Flair, Arn, Benoit and Mongo McMichael. Mid-1996 also saw the debut of the New World Order, a group who had intentions of destroying the traditions of WCW. The Horsemen represented tradition, even with Mongo McMichael as a member, and naturally the NWO feuded with the Horsemen. The problem was, fans cheered for the NWO, and the Horsemen were booked to lose consistently to Eric Bischoff's new faction. This is still something that doesn't sit well with Ric Flair, and you can easily see why. The Horsemen had forever been a cornerstone of Crockett Promotions, and it seemed they were being tossed aside, taking loss after loss to the New World Order. Jeff Jarrett ended up coming over to WCW around this time, and he announced he wanted to be a Horseman. Jeff did indeed join the group, but was kicked out in February '97 due to bickering within the group. Later in the year, Arn Anderson had to retire due to neck issues, and Kurt Hennig was named as the new enforcer of the Horsemen. But Kurt ended up turning on the Horsemen at Fall Brawl 1997, joining the NWO and once again making the Horsemen look like a bunch of second-class WCW citizens. Flair disbanded the Horsemen in September of 1997, and everyone went their separate ways. The following year, Dean Malenko and Chris Benoit began badgering Arn Anderson to reform the Four Horsemen, but Arn kept refusing. Flair had a disagreement with Eric Bischoff which led to him taking time away from the ring, and the NWO was running rampant on WCW television. The time was right to bring back the Horsemen, and Arn Anderson finally agreed to reform the faction. The September 14th, 1998 edition of Nitro is easily one of my favourite wrestling shows. Not a favourite WCW show, but a favourite wrestling show. Arn Anderson, Dean Malenko, Chris Benoit, Steve McMichael and J.J. Dillon stood in the ring and announced that the Horsemen would be returning. One thing was missing though, there was no Ric Flair. When it seemed like Arn had finished the promo, he said, "I almost forgot the Fourth Horseman," before shouting for Ric Flair to make his way to the ring. And when Flair came out at the entranceway, the crowd reaction was insane. An emotional Ric Flair got in the ring, ripped into Eric Bischoff, and the Horsemen were back in business. This iteration included Flair, Malenko, Benoit and McMichael, with Arn serving as the manager. Honestly, if you have never seen this promo, you need to see it. In a time when the bad guys were becoming cool and WCW as a whole had turned into a completely different show to what it was, it's crystal clear here that the fans still had a lot of love for Ric Flair and the Four Horsemen. I wish I could say the reunion led to success, but this was WCW in the late 90s. Benoit and Malenko had incredible matches of course, but Flair again wasn't booked very favourably, taking more losses to the NWO and working matches with Eric Bischoff which did nothing really to boost Flair or the Horsemen. The group turned heel in early 1999, but honestly there's not much to talk about here. David Flair became associated with the Horsemen and Rick began favouring his son. This led to Dean Malenko and Chris Benoit leaving the Horsemen and forming the Revolution with Perry Saturn and Shane Douglas. The Horsemen were now finally officially done with. We can't really end this video without talking about Evolution, the WWE stable that formed in 2002 and also included Ric Flair. Evolution's concept was that the group would include wrestling's past, Ric Flair, wrestling's present, Triple H, and wrestling's future, Dave Bautista and Randy Orton. The group was heavily inspired by the Horsemen, all decked out in expensive suits and becoming a dominant team that pretty much mirrored the mid-80s Horsemen. This wasn't a shameless rip-off either. Triple H has frequently said that Evolution was indeed the modern version of the Horsemen, and along with this, the group was extremely successful. It speaks highly of the Horsemen's impact in the world of wrestling that heel stables have tried to emulate the original group, and I do feel that other factions, not just Evolution, have a lot to thank the Horsemen for. The Four Horsemen truly revolutionised heel factions in professional wrestling.